Imagine walking through a medieval town square in the 15th century. The air is heavy with smoke from the blacksmith's forge, the smell of bread from the market stalls, but your attention is fixed on the crowd. Everyone is gathering, eyes wide with expectation. Not for a festival, not for a sermon, but for something far more unsettling. The punishment of a neighbor, carried out in front of everyone. In the 15th century, justice wasn't hidden behind courtroom doors or locked inside prison walls. It was a public spectacle designed to send a message. People believed that crime had to be punished not only to correct the guilty, but to teach the entire community what would happen if they stepped out of line. Fear itself was the strongest weapon of the law. Punishments ranged from mild to terrifying. For small crimes, the guilty might be forced into stocks, a wooden frame that trapped their hands and head. Imagine standing there for hours or even days, unable to move, while children threw rotten food at you and neighbors whispered insults. Humiliation was the point. In a world where reputation was everything, being laughed at by your own town could feel worse than physical pain. But the spectacle went far beyond humiliation. The authorities, both secular and religious, believed that justice had to be visible, almost theatrical. That's why punishments were often staged in marketplaces, churchyards, or the busiest crossroads. The entire village was invited to watch. Some people came out of curiosity, others to teach their children a lesson, and some even cheered. Justice in the Middle Ages was a performance, and everyone had a role. The idea of fairness was very different from today. Modern law aims to protect rights, but in the 15th century, the goal was to restore order and remind society of its boundaries. If you stole bread, you weren't just a thief, you had broken the trust of your entire community. If you lied under oath, you didn't just deceive a person, you offended God himself. And so the punishments were symbolic. They targeted the part of the body connected to the crime. A liar's tongue might be marked, a thief's hand shamed, and a cheater paraded through the streets. It's important to remember, these punishments weren't always about cruelty. They were about fear, discipline, and the belief that public shame would stop others from following the same path. Justice was not hidden. It was written across the body of the guilty, in front of every pair of watching eyes. The 15th century was an age where authority was fragile. Kings fought for power, cities battled over trade, and the church feared heresy. Punishment became a tool to control not just individuals, but entire populations. It was a warning. Obey the law, obey the church, or face consequences you cannot hide from. And this is where we begin our journey. Into a world where the law was harsh, where justice was loud and public, and where fear was the most effective prison of all. In the 15th century, one of the most common and unforgettable punishments wasn't a whip or a chain, it was humiliation. Imagine standing in the center of your town, not as a citizen, but as a living example of failure. Your body trapped, your face exposed, your dignity stripped away while the entire community judged you. The most iconic symbol of this punishment was the pillory, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. Once locked inside, a person could not move, not even to wipe their face. Hours, sometimes days, were spent under the open sky, in rain or sun, while townspeople gathered. Some threw rotten vegetables, others spat, children mocked, and neighbors gossiped about your sins. The real pain wasn't the wood pressing into your neck. It was the laughter, the shame, and the fact that you could never hide. For smaller crimes, such as cheating at the market or spreading false rumors, there were the stocks. Here, the legs were locked instead of the head, forcing the guilty to sit helplessly on the ground. Once again, the goal wasn't only discomfort, it was public exposure. In a society where honor meant everything, being mocked by your own community was a punishment that stayed with you long after you were released. But humiliation didn't always mean being locked in wood. Sometimes, punishments turned into performances. A thief might be forced to walk through the streets carrying the very item they tried to steal, bread, cloth, or a chicken, while the crowd laughed at their disgrace. An unfaithful spouse could be paraded on a donkey, facing backward, a symbol of foolishness. These spectacles were carefully designed to attack not just the body, but the reputation. The church also played its part in public shame. People accused of moral sins could be forced to wear special clothing or stand at the church doors with signs describing their offense. Imagine entering Sunday Mass, only to see your neighbor kneeling outside with a placard reading, "Liar, drunkard, or thief." It was a reminder that forgiveness came only after humiliation. Even the way people were punished told a story. Each act of shame carried symbolism. A liar's tongue might be clamped briefly with an iron instrument to warn others of dishonesty. A gossip could be marched through town with a wooden bridle around her head, a device that silenced the mouth. None of these punishments were designed to kill, but all were meant to leave a scar on memory. For the community, these spectacles were more than justice, they were entertainment. People left their work, brought their children, and treated public punishment as a lesson and a show. It was a medieval theater where the actors were unwilling, but the audience was always eager. Why did this matter so much? Because in the 15th century, your reputation was your currency. To lose it meant to lose trust, business, marriage prospects, and even survival. In many ways, being shamed in public was worse than a physical beating. Pain could fade, but humiliation followed you forever. This was justice by spectacle, a punishment designed not only for the guilty, but for everyone watching. It whispered to the crowd, "Remember this face, remember this crime, and don't make the same mistake." If humiliation was the theater of medieval justice, then corporal punishment was its physical mark. In the 15th century, justice was not only about shaming you in front of neighbors, it was about leaving a reminder on your body, something that would speak louder than words long after the punishment was over. The most common form was whipping. Could happen in the town square, in the market, or even at the steps of a church. The whip was not just meant to cause pain, it was meant to teach obedience. To the crowd, every strike was a warning. This is what happens when you defy the law. But beyond pain, whipping carried a message of control. It reminded people that the authorities had the right to discipline, much like a strict parent over a child. Another method was branding. A hot iron pressed against the skin left a permanent mark, sometimes a letter, sometimes a symbol. A thief might carry a T, a fraudster a different sign. These marks followed you for life, visible proof of past crimes. Imagine trying to find work, marry, or even trade at the market, all while everyone could see your punishment burned into your skin. Branding turned the body into a record of guilt. But not all corporal punishments were so permanent. Some were designed as warnings rather than lifelong scars. Cutting hair, shaving eyebrows, or forcing someone to walk barefoot through town might seem mild today. But in the 15th century, appearance was tied to honor. To strip someone of dignity was to strip them of social standing. There were also punishments that altered the body in symbolic ways. For example, a liar might have their mouth briefly clamped or forced to carry a heavy wooden gag. A gambler might be made to wear dice around his neck, a cheater forced to wear a horned cap, a public joke that everyone understood. These punishments worked because they didn't just punish the body. They ridiculed the crime itself. For nobles and wealthy citizens, corporal punishments were rare. Money often replaced pain. But for peasants, the poor, and the powerless, the whip, the brand, or the shaven head were daily reminders of a world where the law was written on the flesh. And yet, not all of this was purely cruelty. People of the 15th century truly believed corporal punishment restored balance. If you had taken something, something had to be taken from you, even if it was only your pride, your reputation, or a piece of your appearance. To them, this was justice, plain and simple. What strikes us today as harsh and inhumane was, for them, part of the rhythm of life. Markets were for trade, churches for prayer, and squares for justice. The whip cracked not only against the guilty but against the silence of the crowd, reminding everyone of the thin line between order and chaos. This was corporal punishment in the 15th century, not hidden in prisons but displayed for all to see, a performance carved into the body, echoing the belief that pain and shame could heal society. In the 15th century, justice was not only about punishment, it was also about confession. And in a time when truth was seen as fragile and elusive, authorities believed they had a powerful tool to force it out: torture. To us today, it sounds cruel and unthinkable, but in the Middle Ages it was considered a perfectly legal procedure, even an essential part of the courtroom. The logic was simple. If someone resisted admitting their crime, perhaps pain would loosen their tongue. Confession was everything in medieval law. Without it, judges often hesitated to convict. But with it, guilt seemed undeniable. So the belief grew that truth could be squeezed, stretched, or forced out of the body, just as one might press oil from an olive. Torture chambers were not hidden in dark castles, as we often imagine in movies. Many towns had small rooms near courthouses or dungeons beneath city halls. These spaces were designed to remind the accused of power. Dim lighting, heavy chains, and the presence of officials created an atmosphere of fear before a single question was even asked. The setting itself was part of the process. The methods varied, but one thing remained constant: symbolism. Torture wasn't only about physical suffering, it was about breaking the will. The rack, for example, became infamous not only for stretching limbs but also for stretching truth. The sight of it alone often caused people to confess before it was ever used. Similarly, devices like the boot or heavy weights played on the fear of what could happen, not always what did happen. Fear was the sharpest tool of all. It's important to understand that torture was often carefully staged. Officials wanted the confession, not necessarily permanent harm. Documents from the time show that some sessions ended quickly, with the accused giving in after only a few minutes of pressure. In many cases, the theater of torture, the atmosphere, the presence of instruments, the shouts of the interrogator, did more than the instruments themselves. Religion also played a role. Confession was tied to salvation, so admitting guilt under duress could still be framed as cleansing the soul. Judges often felt they were helping both the law and God by extracting the truth. Inquisitors especially saw torture as a way of saving heretics, believing that forcing an admission of guilt was better than letting a soul wander unrepentant. Of course, this system had flaws. Fear could make anyone say anything. Innocent people sometimes confessed to crimes they never committed just to end the ordeal. But in the eyes of the 15th century, confession was proof, and proof was justice. Few stopped to question whether truth under pain was truth at all. For the crowd outside, rumors of what happened inside those chambers spread quickly. Stories grew larger with every telling. Chains rattling, screams echoing, shadows on the walls. Whether real or imagined, these stories served the same purpose as public punishments. They scared people into obedience. Even if you never set foot in a torture chamber, the thought of it was enough to keep you in line. So, torture in the 15th century wasn't just about cruelty. It was about control. It was about convincing society that the law had the power to reach not only your body, but your very words and thoughts. To admit guilt under such pressure was to surrender completely body, mind, and soul. This chapter of justice reminds us that medieval law was less about fairness and more about authority. Torture was never simply punishment. It was a performance of fear, a ritual meant to show that the truth belonged to those in power. And in a world built on fear, that performance was often all it took. When we think of medieval justice, one image always comes to mind: the executioner standing before a silent crowd. In the 15th century, the death penalty was not just punishment. It was a message written on the stage of the town square. For kings, nobles, and city officials, death sentences were about more than ending a life. They were about control, power, and the theater of fear. The most common method was hanging. Simple, direct, and public. Wooden gallows were built in busy squares or on hills outside the city walls. Everyone could see them, even from a distance. A gallows was not only a tool, it was a landmark, a constant reminder that the law could reach anyone. People passing by were reminded every day of what breaking the rules might cost. Another powerful image was the burning stake, often linked with heresy. For many communities, this was not about cruelty but about cleansing. Fire was seen as a purifying force, capable of destroying sin itself. Religious leaders used it as a symbol of absolute authority. Disobey the church, and your soul would be burned along with your body. Whether or not the fire was actually used often mattered less than the fear it inspired. Drowning and burying alive also appear in records, usually for crimes tied to morality, like infidelity or witchcraft. But again, the the real weight of these punishments was not always in their frequency. It was in their spectacle. People remembered them, whispered about them, and taught their children to fear them. Executions were often public holidays. Merchants set up stalls, children ran between crowds, and food was sold as people gathered to watch. It was a grim kind of festival, where justice and entertainment blended together. Officials wanted the crowd present, because every gasp, every prayer, and every whisper made the warning stronger. Nobles and royals faced their own versions of death sentences. Instead of common gallows, they were often executed with more honor, such as beheading by sword. Even here, ceremony mattered. A noble execution was still a performance, carefully staged to show that no one, not even the highborn, could escape the law. And yet, not everyone condemned to death actually died. Records show that some were spared at the last moment, granted mercy by a ruler or pardoned in the name of God. These sudden reversals were also a tool of power. By sparing one life while ending another, leaders reminded their people that authority held not only the sword, but also the power of forgiveness. The 15th century saw executions not only as justice but as a way to shape society. Each gallows raised in a town square, each fire lit in a courtyard, was less about the condemned and more about the living. It whispered to the crowd, "Obey, or this could be you." Today, these punishments seem brutal and unthinkable. But in their world, they were the foundation of order. Death was not just the end of a criminal. It was the ultimate warning carved into the memory of the community. The punishments of the 15th century may seem distant, but their shadows still linger in our culture today. They remind us of a time when justice was not hidden in quiet courtrooms but displayed in the open, where every punishment was a message and every town square was a stage. What can we take from this? First, that medieval justice was less about fairness and more about fear. Public humiliation, corporal marks, torture, and executions were all designed to keep society in line. The goal was not simply to correct one person. It was to remind everyone else of the dangers of stepping outside the rules. Fear was law's strongest ally. Second, punishment was about community. In our modern world, prisons and courts separate justice from daily life. But in the Middle Ages, justice was woven into the fabric of society. Children saw it. Merchants paused their trade to watch it. Priests preached about it. The entire community was both audience and participant. In this way, punishment was not just law, it was culture. And third, these punishments reveal how fragile authority really was. Kings and bishops, city councils and nobles, they all ruled over people who might rebel, cheat, or disobey. To keep control, they needed reminders, spectacles, and fear. The more unstable the world felt, the harsher the punishments became. But even in this harshness, we see echoes of our present. Public shaming in medieval squares may be gone, yet digital humiliation on the internet follows a similar pattern. Branding criminals with hot irons has vanished, yet records and reputations still mark people for life. Fear of authority, desire for order, and the spectacle of punishment are not just medieval stories. They are human stories that continue in new forms. Looking back, we might ask, did these punishments truly work? The answer depends on perspective. They certainly scared people and they kept many from breaking the law. But they also created resentment, suffering, and injustice. They built obedience but not necessarily trust. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy. The punishments of the Middle Ages remind us how far justice has come, and how easily it can slip back into fear and spectacle. Today, we value fairness, human rights, and the dignity of the individual. These ideas would have seemed strange, even laughable, to a 15th century official. Yet they were born out of centuries of brutality and reflection. So when we think of the gallows, the pillory, or the torch, we should see more than cruelty. We should see the long road humanity has traveled to reach the justice systems we have today. A road paved with fear, shame, and harsh lessons, but also with the determination to find a better way. In the end, the 15th century teaches us that justice is never just about crime and punishment. It is about who holds power, how they use it, and what message they choose to send. And the echoes of that choice, whether in a medieval square or in our own time, can last for centuries.